another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Oh, welcome everybody again to another episode of our show with another really fascinating guest today. Today we have the honor of being joined by none other than Emmy Award-winning television commentator, radio personality, and newspaper columnist, Mr. Juan Williams. And for those of you who have not watched TV or listened to the radio over the past couple decades, Mr. Williams has been a Fox News contributor since 1997, including being a member of their nightly current issue discussion show known as The Five, writes for several newspapers, including the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and published in numerous magazines like The Atlantic and Time. He was a senior news analyst at NPR for 11 years and at the Washington Post for 23 years as an editorial writer, op-ed columnist, the White House correspondent, and national correspondent. Mr. Williams is an accomplished author with multiple books, including but not limited to Thurgood Marshall, American Revolutionary, Eyes on the Prize, America's Civil Rights Years, and We the People, the modern-day figures who have reshaped and affirmed the Founding Fathers' vision for America. He has been active on his alma mater at Haverford College Board of Managers, the Aspen Institute Communication Society program, and the Washington Journalism Center, and sits on the board of the directors of the New York Civil Rights Coalition. And interestingly, when he's not doing all of that, Mr. Williams serves as a strategic advisor to an organization that we profiled a few weeks ago on the show, known as Generations United, which is a really interesting organization dedicated to improving the lives of children, youth, and elderly through intergenerational collaboration, public policies, and programs. And based on Mr. Williams, a long-time position at sort of the epicenter of the media, and also hanging out in the Beltway with his ears to all the power players and government, think tanks, foundations, and so forth, can bring us some really interesting perspectives, not just on the intergenerational issues, but also the future of aging in the United States. So with all that, Juan Williams, welcome to our show.
Ira, thank you. Boy, what a glorious introduction. It's far friendlier than I normally get on television, I'll tell you that.
That's okay. I wanted to get cross all my T's and dot my I's, but
sure. I just want to quickly mention to your listeners and viewers that I would love it if they would read my weekly column in The Hill every Monday morning.
Absolutely. I'd like to start things off going back about 20 years now. You when you were at NPR, you hosted a town hall meeting. It was entitled "The Changing Face of the Elderly in America," yes. And you profiled two things. One, that being elderly was changing in the U.S. People are living longer, healthier. Grandparents are rollerblading, living this more vigorous life. But at the same time, you pointed out that we have these major cohorts developing. You termed it, I think, a little later on, sort of this barbell effect, where we have a lot of really young people, 18 and below, and some millennials, and then a lot of people over the age of 65, and they have very different interests, political, economic, healthcare-wise. Talk about a little, bit about these issues, how you first sort of focused on this issue, and then ultimately how you got involved with Generations United because of it.
Well, it's so much there, Ira, but let's just take what I think is the central piece of what you want to discuss. And that basically fits with something that's in the news these days, which is the latest Census Bureau reports, indicating that the American population is in fact experiencing its slowest rate of growth, I think the second slowest in all the time that the census has been done in this country, 7% or so. We're now up to about 40 million people in the country. And the primary reason for this slow growth rate is, one, that what we're seeing is a very low birth rate in the country, specifically among white Americans. But the second part of it is we've slowed down immigration, and we, of course, consistently have an increase in terms of the aged cohort in the American population. And as we know, as I can tell you as a 67-year-old, as you get older, you get closer to death. So that cohort is dying off. So this is an interesting reality, because the way that I thought of it back when I was doing this story for NPR, the town hall meetings that you mentioned, was to say, how is it that we have continued growth in terms of the size of the American population, despite the fact that we have a decline in birth rate and we have a rapidly aging population, this large group over the age of 65. And as you were saying, part of this is people are living longer. People simply have a longer lifespan and they're more active, more engaged. They have lots of disposable income and disposable time in retirement. So they were changing the way that we think about that elderly population, travel more engaged in sports and fitness, more, vocational activities, people who wanted to get into woodworking or gardening. Just think about all the things that you say, oh yeah, boy, that's bigger than ever right now. Yeah, because there's a population that's a marketplace for it, and they are pretty much those folks over 65. I'm a sports fan, and I didn't see this until recently with my life experience. But if I go to a baseball game and sit in a good seat, if I go to the basketball game and sit in a good seat, it's striking to me that I am surrounded by other people over 65. It's like going to a Simon and Garfunkel concert. I'm the youngest guy in the house. It's like, whoa, all these people have come out because they have the time and the income and they can afford this good seat. And that's that older population. I think it tells you a lot about what's going on. Now, before we go too far, let me say the other side of this picture is that there's a large population of people between the ages of 0 to 18, even larger. I think it's more than half the population if you go up to the age of 34. So you see that as you were describing, and as I had said during the NPR broadcast, it's like a barbell, and with one weight on one end and the other on the other side. Now, when I did the NPR show, part of the experience for me was going to a school in Minnesota. I had gone to this school because I wanted to understand what young people in the country had as their priorities. And what I found was overwhelmingly, their priorities had to do with things like social safety net issues. They want healthcare coverage that they don't have. This is a population that's disproportionately made up of people of color, of immigrants. And the reason that they want those social safety net programs is that oftentimes they are income insecure, if not just poor. A lot of these kids come from single parent households, and they are struggling to make it, to not only achieve their dreams, but just in terms of basic financial stability. Things like hunger insecurity. Those of us who are fortunate might be out of touch with it. The reason I went to this school, Washburn High in Minnesota, was to try to understand what kind of political priorities and things were important to these young people. And as I was saying, a lot of these young people are immigrants, minorities, and income insecure. That's why they want these social safety net programs. Even back then, they were talking about the need for being sure that they had healthcare coverage. They are concerned about basic living things that would give them the opportunity to achieve their American dream. Now, this is a stark contrast from when I went to Orlando, Florida, to visit with the seniors.
Yep.
And there, the seniors, in terms of their political priorities, were quite distinct from what I heard from the young people. Why is that? Well, the seniors aren't concerned with social safety net programs. They have them. Yep. They have Medicare, right? If they're poor, they have Medicaid. But what they are concerned about is the cost of prescription drugs, access to good hospitals and medical care. This is what they want. And they don't want any increase in taxes that would come from improvements in the social safety net. They see this as taking away from what they have. It's one of those, it's almost a cliche now, but if you talk to a senior, they say, don't touch my Social Security, don't touch my Medicare. And you say, well, you know, those are government assistance programs. And they say, no, I paid into it. That's my money. And you think, well, not really. I mean, it's a little bit of a pyramid scheme, you know, to keep Social Security and Medicaid going, but that's Medicare going, but that's what they think. They see it as belonging to them. And so they separate themselves out in terms of need for government services from this younger group. And then you have to also throw in the fact that this younger group, as I mentioned, more so people who are immigrants, more so people of color, and coming from a totally different cultural milieu, you know, whereas, as I mentioned earlier, the seniors are Simon and Garfunkel and Mick Jagger, maybe Tina Turner. The younger people are the hip hop groups, you know, and these two oftentimes are a sharp contrast. The interesting thing about this moment now, years later after I did these town hall meetings for NPR, is that I see so many of these demographic contrasts and conflicts playing out in American politics today. I mean, I think it, you know, it sounds like a little bit of patting myself on the back, but I just think the demographic trends have continued in such a fashion as to, I think, make it even more clear how the generational divide is tearing at the country's social fabric. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump supporters are, this is overwhelming, older people, white people, and people living in suburban and rural areas of the country. And what you see is that the Democrat supporters, the people who voted for President Obama, President Biden, overwhelming numbers are people who are younger, more educated, by the way, more racially diverse, higher levels of immigrants, and living in the big cities, and typically on the coast, but Chicago and Houston would also be included. So what you see is that this generational divide has political implications and consequences. And you can also see it in terms of things like who gives money to politicians, who has voice in terms of American media. You know, I work in a media forum, cable news, sure, where the average age of our viewer, Ira, is near 70. I mean, I sometimes say this and people, they can't believe it. And I say, nope, that's absolutely true. And the younger people don't watch news in the way that the older people do. And the news or information they watch tends to be much more oriented towards social media platforms. So they are getting different information, different stories, and the whole notion of common ground that is so important, I think, in a democracy. Citizens talking about the same stories and trying to understand those stories as, you know, giving them insights into key issues. That's dissolving because the younger generation is getting different stories and from the stories that are being heard, listened, watched by the older crowd. So we are at a moment when I think you're seeing the generational divide writ large. Now, one last thing on this point. When we have political discussions, not just between Ira and Juan, but just general political discussions in America, we almost never mention the generational divide. I don't know if you noticed this. It's almost like people step around it. It's like people say, oh, Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, and liberals, progressives, and right-wingers, and all this language. You sometimes say, well, who are these people? And you know what you find overwhelmingly is, gosh, those younger people tend to be the progressives. They tend to be more liberal. And on the conservative side, those seniors are the ones who tend to be more conservative and more concerned that the pace of change in the country is coming too quickly and it's discombobulating them. And they want to conserve or preserve what they had before. I mean, Trump, you know, encapsulated, make America great again, you know, keep us the way we were, if not take us back in time. the younger crowd is moving on.
So leaping forward from that, and that goes perfectly into my next question, you moderated a discussion, I think it was in 2017 at the National Press Club. It was the Generation United and Eisner Foundation survey time. The report was called "I Need You, You Need Me, the Young, the Old, and What We Can Achieve Together," and revolved around this concept of intergenerational cohesion, the different things that, as you're pointing out, things that we can learn from what you're learning, what Donna Butts and the group at Generations United are learning about what can be done, whether it's a Holocaust survivor meeting with a young refugee, or an ex-convict that got his life in order, dealing with the younger generation of maybe a troubled child. Talk about some of the things that you see in ways that this intergenerational cohesion and what you're learning at GU can apply to some of these other big issues that you routinely talk about on the news nowadays.
Well, I'll tell you, I have one striking memory of just that session with Generations United. And it's this, coming to realize, as Donna Butts and the Generations United team was giving out awards, that they were calling attention to people who saw that the generations, in fact, have common goals and common ground. And this, I think the reason it hit me so hard, Ira, is I don't usually hear that from the politicians. Usually they talk about these two groups as quite separate, having the separate priorities we discussed earlier. But here was Donna Butts and Generations United saying, I'll give you a specific example. Thank you to a citizens group that work with the city, I forget which city, to put in place a senior citizen center where it was connected to a school so that kids after school had somewhere to go, but also had somebody there in terms of the senior citizens to tutor them, to help them with projects, to help them with remedial work in terms of their education. And it gave the older people the kind of sense of community and companionship and investment in the younger generation that helped them sustain themselves and not get lonely or alienated and locked in front of a TV tube. And I was thinking, this is great. This is wonderful. This is thinking multi-generationally to the benefit of both sides. And I was just so knocked out by it because, again, instead of talking about the divide, here was talk about the common ground between the generations. And here was a willingness to even address the fact that there is a separation in the generations in our current American demographic, and we need to figure out how to knit these two together.
And sorry to want to ping pong around your life a little bit here, but one other report that, or another session that you were involved in, this is a panel discussion with AARP, I think it was in 2010, and you were, it's called the Social Security and the Future Retirement. And obviously you were talking a lot about Social Security and the different entitlement programs and so forth. But I want to focus on one area that sort of came off of that, which had to do with the health economic benefits of intergenerational type of activities, because as you know, we spend 7 point whatever trillion nowadays annually on healthcare in our country. But some of the benefits that come out of the intergenerational interaction, obesity, smoking reduction, reduction in dementia when someone's not sitting around staring at the wall, but is interacting with somebody. These cost trillions of dollars, and there's, they're grouped in this area of sort of the social determinants of health nowadays. Talk a little bit about some of the healthcare benefits, because these are issues on both sides of the barbell. And if we can reduce trillions of dollars via intergenerational type of activity, benefits everybody.
Well, I think this is so glaring. One, I mentioned alienation as a big issue for the older population. But, your spouse dies, your friends die, you just become more separated, and the world's, can seem like a very strange place, especially all these young people, what they're up to, who knows, right? But again, there's the opportunity, and this is what Generations United was talking about, to bring people together. Now, the Social Security thing, it's so obvious. Who's paying for the Social Security benefits for the older population? It's that younger cohort, and you want to make sure that they are working, that they have jobs, that they are fruitfully, constructively employed, and not, in fact, ending up uneducated or in jail or something like that. The older generation needs the younger generation to sustain themselves. But it's beyond that in terms of the politics that are at play here. The older generation also needs to be invested in terms of their own, well, oftentimes children, grandchildren. So when you're stopping to think about, you know, what you're leaving behind, your inheritance on this earth, even across racial lines, even across lines of native born or not native born, this is the inheritance that's being left by the older generation for the younger generation. And opening their eyes to this reality, I think, changes their perception. No longer do they see that the younger people as some kind of rivals for a politician's budget or a politician's attention, but they see them as people who could carry on American values, carry on the strength and power of the American dream and the American economy. And in that regard, then, again, we see the opportunity to bring people together, to knit the generations in a very positive, constructive mode. But you have to stop and think about it because, as I said, people don't have these conversations in this way. Instead, what we're all accustomed to is the finger pointing. You know, the old lady sitting on the porch pointing at those rude kids, and the kids with that loud music, and or the kids are a threat because somebody says, oh, they look thuggish, or they listen to that rap music, or, you know, and the kids see the old people as stuck in the mud and uncaring or just antagonistic. And in both of sessions, Social Security, looking in terms of the economics, and Generations United, looking in terms of the culture and the education, you can see these two groups across the generations need each other.
It's, you know, last week, I think it was, in one of sort of the Bill Maher's monologues, he made the point that ageism seems to be one of the only isms that we're kind of okay with still, with all the other isms that we're dealing with. In your, you know, once again, hanging out in DC and having your ear to the ground with everything that's going on, where's ageism sit as a priority in the in everything that we're dealing with nowadays? Is it in the top 20, the top 100? Where does, because I mean, ageism is a, you know, you're just pointing out, is a serious thing, but it's in the way of so much. Is it a topic, or is it one of those things that it's to the next administration when it's not that important for everything else that's going on right now?
But Ira, help me. So what are you thinking about when you use the term ageism? Is that solely directed at people who are over 65?
Just, that guy's old, I'm not going to hire him. I want to hang out with him. You know, the general pool that, you know, us young people.
The reason I asked the question for the clarification was, I think there's ageism also directed at that younger group.
Exactly.
So it's like, you know, when Bill Maher talks about ageism, I think he's in line with what you're saying about hiring, looks, beauty. You know, we celebrate, you know, physical ability. And so if we see people without physical ability, you know, we tend to look away or not to embrace. And that is directed at the seniors. I don't think there's any question about it. And you see this in the cosmetic industry, you know, plastic surgery, the lip stuff, the Botox. I mean, it goes on and on because they are trying to avoid being subjected to the burden of that kind of ageist thinking, they want to look younger, and they don't think that people will accept them looking older for who they are. So this begins, I think, on a personal level with your spouse, or if you're single, with, your own people. But I must say that I think it extends quickly to employers, and it extends quickly to the idea of government social service programs and the like. That what you see is that too often ageism leads people to be left alone or not considered an important part of a community. It's painful. I was mentioning to you earlier that if I go to a ball game, I am sometimes surprised to see a large number of older people in the seats. And I think for them, it becomes another form of church, if you will. This is an event you can go to with a large gathering of people. Everybody is there cheering or engaged. And sometimes, it's just the stadium or arena staff, and the old people say hello to them and they say hello to the seniors. I think there's a kind of exchange there that at first I didn't pick up on, but I think is very important to the seniors and defeats the kind of ageist stereotype that they wouldn't be involved or wouldn't be aware of the sports team or what's going on. And the other angle, which you hadn't mentioned, which I think is also true, is that for young people, there's the concern that they are being dismissed as lacking because they don't have experience or they don't have the financial resources that the older folks have. And what's interesting is, of course, the biggest slice in here, the so-called millennials, they're struggling at either end of this. That's kind of like the sandwich, caught in the middle of these two large cohorts on either end of the demographic barbell. But for them also, I think that there is pressure to somehow feel like they want to make it in this country, even at a time when, there's rising income inequality and there's difficulties along the way. But the amount of attention paid to ageism in what we've just been discussing, that picture we've been painting about the divide between the generations, I don't think there's ever been greater in American history. Of course, on one level, that's fortunate because we have more people living longer. Longevity has never been so prevalent in American society, in any society. We've never seen it. On the other hand, America is one of the youngest places on the earth, and nobody even realizes this because in fact, the largest single cohort in terms of demographics in the country is people 0 to 18. Maybe you can extend it up to 25. That's the dominant cohort at the moment in American life.
Fascinating dynamic. I want to sort of tilt now in sort of one direction on the barbell, but this affects the other side, actually. We're coming out of this major pandemic, and we hear a lot about sort of certain silver linings that have been highlighted, that, hey, we have to improve our supply chains and produce critical products and equipment here in the U.S., make drug development more efficient and so forth. One issue that's not highlighted as much is the fact that we learned that the elderly, biologically respond differently to infections, different immune systems. It changes over time. Interestingly, in the United States, we spend a tremendous amount of money on medical research. We spend a lot on cancer and Alzheimer's, and Alzheimer's and heart disease, unfortunately, come for some of us over time. Aging comes for all of us, and we spend, though, very little proportionately as a country on the biology of aging. When I talk about the biology of aging, I mean all the stuff that happens behind the scenes that leads to the cancer, leads to the Alzheimer's. We do have a National Institutes of Aging, and we study the dynamic, but rather small amounts. However, we spend a lot of time on this show talking to some of those researchers and basically how we can, once again, reduce that morbidity, increase health span. So, creating that 90-year-old that is like a 60-year-old, and where those diseases where we spend the trillions at the end of life happen really at the end of life. Based on your experience in dealing with these major issues, when it comes to something like this, whether it's aging research, climate change, some of the big picture issues that are always thrown around in the powers of our government, what does it take to put an issue like the aging on the table in a major way, so that that those millions that we spend on that issue become hundreds of billions proportionately? What are some of the things that you've seen over your career that can get moonshot type stuff moving in the United States?
Well, you have to increase awareness. And I think that one of the difficulties right now is lack of awareness. You just pinpointed something that is so true. And when I say true, I mean obvious, glaring. It's well known, it's no secret, that we spend a disproportionate amount of our healthcare dollars on the final year of anyone's life. And that's where the money goes, because we believe in the value, the sanctity of life, and we're going to go to extremes to try to preserve life, even when it's difficult to see how this has a positive outcome. So the question that you're asking to me seems again to fit into the obvious category. Why not, instead of putting all this money in at the very end of life, when the outcome seems very difficult to alter or improve, why not put it in terms of healthcare that could benefit someone, if not in the entirety of their youth to middle age to senior status, but to old age? Why not put more of that money into people in terms of preserving their health in youth, middle age, senior status, so that they can enjoy a better quality of life into their years as an elderly person? To me, this is obvious, as I said to you. I think it's pretty doggone, glaring, but it doesn't get attention. It never gets resolved. I've been on panels over my course of my career and heard these numbers and statistics, and it never changes. So Ira comes to me and says, well, how do you change that? How do you get the politicians to be aware? Well, again, it's not that they're not aware of it, but I think it's one of these issues of failure to engage, failure to focus and say, this is a governing principle in terms of my legislative agenda, in terms of my budgetary priorities. It's hard to get the politicians to say, yeah, we got to do this. Part of this, by the way, is the voters, because the voters aren't saying, oh yeah, I'm worried about shifting the healthcare burden and priority from taking care of someone who's near death and shifting it back to the middle. Obamacare, for example, is a last resort for a lot of people and still expensive. But that barely was able to get into law and sustained a great deal of negative publicity. I think we're more than 10 years in now. It's becoming more popular, but always subject to attacks from the conservatives who seek to undermine it. So I think that tells you something about our attitude towards healthcare. The people who have it in terms of the Medicare plan, the Medicaid plan, et cetera, think, they've got a plan, and they have some resentment towards those younger people seeking additional protections in middle age. Because we're not talking about Obamacare really, bailing out the youngest people, that youngest group that we were talking about earlier. But this to me is like a stone in my shoe, Ira. I just don't understand how we can not see that there's this great waste of money. And I think that's a pretty controversial statement. I understand that some people may be offended. But why do we put so much into someone who's dying? So that we can clearly see that is it's a disproportionate use of our resources, rather than to preserve and enable them to lead a better life and potentially a longer life going forward, by helping them to be healthier in middle age and even as seniors.
Stone in my shoe too, but
Okay.
That being said, final question, and this is the fantasy question of the show. The world will listen to Juan Williams and Ira Pastor, and we'll make things happen. When these technologies do get there, and once again, I try to profile as many of them as possible on this show, and really supporting some of these innovators and getting the awareness out. But in that future scenario where we've moved beyond health span, and 90 becomes the new 50, to one that expends natural health span and lifespan, where say 150 becomes the new 50.
150. Wow.
Let's just say, for fantasy purposes, 120, whatever it may be. What is Juan Williams' second act? Because I read that you were a championship baseball and basketball and cross country player back in school. What do you what if you could do it now again? But retain your vitality based on future rejuvenation, regenerative medicine technologies that are coming down the pike that we profile. Did you want to be a doctor, a lawyer, real estate tycoon? What other things did you want to do along the way? I mean, it's great. You can keep doing what you're doing now. I love watching you on TV, but other things.
I don't know. This came to mind recently because I was reading about one of my favorite detective authors, mystery writers, a man named Lawrence Block, and he has written a book about the art of writing. And, almost all of my career is based on writing, whether I'm at a newspaper, NPR, or Fox Television. I think sometimes people lose track that we all have scripts, we all have stories that are being told. And the whole idea is that we share these stories with the audience. So Block talked about the fact that he didn't go to college, but got internships at publishing houses and the like, and was helping with, as an editorial assistant, if not in the mailroom, but it allowed him to study how writing is actually done, and to then start doing his own writing. And when I think back, I think, one, there's lack of confidence on my part in my writing. I wanted to be a newspaper writer as a young person. I love newspapers to this day. I just think that it's like, manna for the mind. You're just like, wow, it opens doors to worlds I'm not in, because there are stories from those worlds, and there's so many. But if I look back, I would say, why didn't I become a screenwriter or a novelist? And if I had had more confidence in my writing talent, I think I would have been more willing to take the risk of failure, because I tend to be very insecure about things like my writing. It's like I don't want to write something and then not have anyone like it, or have it rejected by an editor or a publisher. You know what I'm saying? It's it feels to me like, oh, what did you do? What did you do? So newspapers were a great medium because you're working directly with an editor. If something doesn't work, they can give you some idea, or they get mad at you or whatever, but you're coming back the next days because the business is so rapid, and you just got to keep going. I mean, if you don't succeed, I mean, you're going to get your chances to succeed. My thinking is that as I look forward now, having looked back and say, well, I wish I'd had more confidence in my writing skill. It's not that I would have. I think my mom wanted me to go to graduate school and be like a lawyer, doctor. My brother and sister are both lawyers, they both have law degrees. But I would think that I'm pretty happy as a journalist. I feel like I've had a good career as a journalist. I don't have any regrets in that regard. As I said, if I had been more confident, if it had been at different times in terms of being a Black person in America, I think I would have liked to have done more in terms of the screenplays and the novels. If that door had been of a wider range for me. But going forward now, I think that door is still there.
Sure.
But again, it comes back to the level of confidence, you know, about what I want to do with my time and energy, and am I willing to take the risk to do books or, you know, novels as opposed to nonfiction. I mean, obviously I've had success doing nonfiction historical works, everything from, you know, Eyes on the Prize to Thurgood Marshall, American Revolutionary, and even, you know, We the People. Just these books have sold very well, but it's not the novelistic approach. And that feels to me like, you know, I'd like to step off in that direction.
Wonderful. Juan, any final messages you want to give to the audience? Please take the floor.
You're very kind, Ira. So, you know, the one thing I would say as we come to an end here is I just had my 67th birthday. And I said to my wife, I am more aware at this moment that pretty soon I'm going to be 70. And when you're, you know, 20 years old, someone who's 23 is old, you know, because you just think, oh gosh, they're 23, I'm only 20. Yeah. But I don't care where you are on the map in terms of age, 70 is old. So I was thinking to myself, wow, I'm going to be an old man. Now, everything is relative. A moment ago, you were talking about maybe 150 is the new 90. I don't know. 120 may be the new 70. I don't know.
We'll see.
But these things are possible. But at the moment here, the experience I'm having is much more of, 70 years old. I think everybody sees that as kind of, you know, you're an older person, if not in the winter of life, at the beginning, end of fall and start of the winter of life, that kind of thing. I have grandchildren. I have 3 grandchildren, a 4th on the way. I'm amazed that, you know, I can look at you, Ira, or look at my son and say, you know, I have friends, I know people who are in their 40s. Like, wow, I have a child who's 40 years old. That's unbelievable to me, right? How did I get to be this old? And then you start to worry about the ageism, and you start to worry about losing friends and, you know, not being in touch and as alert and all this kind of stuff. But it just is a level of awareness of age that I think most Americans don't have as you come up, because we're also self-involved. And as I was trying to say earlier, I think our politics are a reflection of the self-involvement as opposed to understanding the breadth of the demographic picture in American life and the breadth of ages that we'll all experience as humans. And the need to start to bring these pictures together, that Juan and Ira as teenage boys have to be aware of Juan and Ira as seniors, and that there is a connection between those two individuals.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wonderful point. Juan, it was great talking to you today.
Thanks, Ira.
Thanks for taking the time out of your schedule to do this. For everybody that's going to be listening or watching on the YouTube, you've been listening to Emmy Award winning television commentator, radio personality, newspaper columnist, Mr. Juan Williams. Read his articles in the Hill magazine, pick up his many books on Amazon, and of course, watch him on the 5 every day on Fox TV. Juan, it's great seeing you. Once again, thank you for taking the time to do this. And as we say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow through everything you do. It was a really great time talking with you.
Thanks, Ira. And it's a pleasure talking with you. You know what? This is a conversation where I learned something you reminded me of some things that I've been through, you know, some of these sessions and panels, relationship to Generations United, that are so important to me. So thank you.
Absolutely.